Hello everyone, we're back at the Classical World Championship match series, Zukertort versus Steinitz. This is the 16th game of the match, where Steinitz plays white and he managed to further increase his lead after this game by winning with white. So let's go straight into the game, see what happens. We see that it was a Spanish, Berlin. And quite modernly, Steinitz went for d3, which is anti-Berlin, as he couldn't get much advantage with the white colors in the previous games in the match. And black plays the system with d6 followed by g6, which I kind of like myself, because if white plays standard way and he develops in a Spanish way, like putting the knight to g3, rook to e1, then goes for d4, then that pawn move to d3 first and then t4 would result in white losing a tempo, right? So d4 is actually quite interesting line, and it forces black to play pretty accurately in the opening. So d4, bishop d7, okay, black indirectly protects the pawn on a5, bishop g7, and now white takes on e5 before black can castle, which is pretty important because if you take with the pawn on e5 first, then white has this possibility where he can take on e4 and queen a4 check. The threat of the check and taking on e4 forces black to play bishop c6. And after bishop c6, knight c6, black will be stuck with the inferior pawn structure. For example, knight b3. And then if black takes, take, for example, knight a5. And after c5, bishop g5 or bishop e3 simple. The endgame is really bad for black. The computer is not impressed. He will say that the black can have good chances of defending this endgame. However, it is quite unpleasant. And no GM, even at the time of the Zukertort, but also in the modern times, they will not go for this structure willingly. So knight e5 was played. White takes on e5. The idea is that if black takes on b5, then there is this trick of knight f7, and if king f7, queen b3 check, and white recaptures the piece on b5, which leads again to a superior structure after d5, for example, queen b5, and rook e8, castles, and if black captures this pawn on e4, then white can recapture the pawn on b7, and he'll be a pawn up for white, which is probably close to winning technical position. Alright, so that's the reason why black has to take on e5, and now Steinitz plays queen e2, which I think is okay, but after castling he plays bishop d3, which I think is not very accurate, because again, this system happens a lot, this trade in Spanish games, but it also happens a lot in London system. We get the structure when black plays e5, and then white's London bishop on f4 and on g5 has to decide where he has to go. And ideally, always in such positions, it was considered good for white to actually trade these light squared bishops. Because black will be stuck with the dark squared bishop on g7, which will be looking at the pawn on e5 on the dark squares, right? So white will have superior bishop on c1 in that case. However, Steinitz plays bishop d3. He thinks that he can outplay Zukertort and keep the pair of bishops. Basically, he likes this position for white. It's a semi-close position. He knows it favors him better because Zukertort really doesn't play these positions for some reason that well. But in this particular game, he plays queen e7, and that is, I think, a small mistake. Black should play knight h5. I think I have a very close to a similar game. Recently, a couple of months ago, I think I played on some blitz game, where black played knight h5 in this exact position, and then black plays bishop h3, which are the computer first line, preventing white, obviously, from castling short side. And white is pretty forced to play g3, otherwise knight f4, right? And now black is simply going for the plan with queen e7, and then mobilizing his rook and going for f5. And if white plays knight b3, then black can play a5. I think black is simply better here. Not much, but he is more active, and white king has to decide where he has to go here. So counterintuitively, long castling seems to be a reasonable choice for white. Again, thanks to the semi-closed character of the position, especially with the closed black bishop on g7, which is not able to participate in the attack on the white king. Black's attack on the queen side is now a little bit dimmed, right? So probably a4, followed by c6 and b5, queen f2, and again, after standards rook fc8, rook fd8, followed by bishop f8, bishop e6, f6. Looks pretty close to equal. Okay, and I was talking earlier about f5 here. Well, it is also possible, however, after castling or first taking on f5, I think taking on f5 is probably preferable because black cannot really take with the pawn on f5. It strands both black pieces, knight on h5 and bishop on h3. So black probably has to take on f5 with the bishop, and then that's a problem because black gets this weakness on e5, right? Of course, it's not so easy for white to use that, but after simple knight d2, for example, rook a d8, and knight e4, black will probably have to try and get this bishop on e4 and exchange it. However, after bishop c2, again, this pawn on e5 is weak, and black will have to play e4 in this type of position sooner or later, because if you ever played King's Indian with black, then you know that opening the bishop on g7 should be the main priority for black, even at the cost of the central pawn on a5. Okay, and this theme actually comes back later in this game, and we'll see how this was important. But Zukertort plays queen e7, and Steinitz plays f3. Again, knight h5 was possible here, opening the g3, making sure white king side is not safe anymore. But bishop c6. Bishop c6, according to the contemporaries of the participants of the World Championship match at the time, they thought that bishop c6 was a mistake. However, in modern chess, we often see black develop the bishop on this diagonal. Basically, both bishops are going to the main diagonals because that's the best place. And so I think bishop c6 is actually not that bad. It does take away some key squares like b5, right, and d5. And in some cases, black actually preparing to play knight h5 followed by f5 here. So bishop c6 is actually not that bad. Of course, it's more normal to see the bishop on e6, and then we have the standard idea where white trades these bishops, and we go into the structure which is considered to be slightly better for white, but black can most likely hold, even though it's passive position. So in the game happened bishop c6, and then we have knight b3. Well, knight b3 is the old move. In the modern chess, of course, we are used to seeing this knight going to c4, and later the knight will go to e3 in order to get to the d5 square. But okay, knight b3, a5 is standard move in modern times again, followed by knight d7. Yeah, if Zukertort had played b6, I would be extremely impressed because this is the modern treatment of the structure for black. And then black idea is usually to go for the knight h5, followed by either bishop f6. And then it's extremely important for black to go and transfer his knight to e6, followed by knight c5. As we can see here, the idea, if white just continues challenging black rooks on d file, then after bishop b5, black is simply better. So both knights on c4 and c5, they are really well placed because they control a lot of squares. And in this case, white bishop on c2 is passive, and black managed to get an equality, a very comfortable one at the very least. And if white plays knight e3, then black still plays bishop b7 with the same idea, and c6, and again, white knights and white pieces are were blunted. There are no squares available for white minor pieces, and black has a very comfortable game. For example, knight g4, bishop g7. It's still pretty equal because knight is transferred to f2 to try to take control of the important d3 square. And again, this looks a pretty comfortable equality for black. I'll be back in a second. So this is a standard plan for black to play these positions. in the structure. Okay, so in the game what happened is that black played knight d7 instead, probably with the same idea, but it's not so easy for black to put the knight on c5 right away. And now Steinitz goes for h4. He realizes that black is doing pretty well here, and he decides to drastically change the course of the game by going for the immediate active chess. So h4, very tricky move. I think that a4 was correct, but now Zukertort plays this h6, and that is the indecisive move, which is also not great from the strategic point of view. So it was more logical for black to play either rook d8 or knight c5 immediately, for example knight c5, and now bishop c4, because of bishop c2, then this bishop on c2 is very passive and he has no access to the diagonal, right? This is important diagonal if white really wants to attack. And black will just play simply knight e6, and black is better. So white has to play bishop c4, and then this important move, after which the threat of b5 actually is pretty huge, right? Trying to chase this bishop away from this diagonal, and because white pieces are pretty far away from attacking black king, I would say that black is doing pretty well here. For example, if g4, then after b5, and white is already forced to play b4 here, and then there's a simple trade of this bishop, or there's knight d3 check. And now in this position only black can be better, I think, because there is nothing with the queen h7, so only one check, and white bishop on a3 was blunted. It has no access to the h6 square, which basically makes white's attack pretty useless. So and if white plays something like a3, then it's still b5, bishop a2, and it's check. And now either knight f4 or anything, or even knight takes b2 probably is pretty good for black, because again white's attack with the lone rook is not enough. Okay, so that was missed chance for black to actually get an advantage by playing knight c5 here. Instead he plays h6, and after h5 he plays g5, and now that of course creates a huge hole on f5 for black pieces, and he can forget about playing any potential f5. Although it's not really true as the game shows, but if white played correctly here, then for example if white just goes for bishop b5, bishop trade, then he would be better, obviously, because after bishop trade the only way for black to control this f5 square would be by knight, and that's not a simple thing to do. Well, alright, so let's go back for a second. White plays knight f1, trying to go with the knight immediately, but that's a bit greedy, okay? Because after knight f1, black could have played f5 right here. And again, for those who play King's Indian, they know this trick. It is sometimes opening the line or diagonal for the bishop is way more important than any pawn, especially considering that white king is still stuck in the center, and knight on f1 momentarily sort of disconnects white rooks and creates disorganization in the white camp. So here either a3 or e4 immediately. I kind of like a3. And again, white structure, black rooks are in the game. Entire black piece formation is in the game actually, and going for the active spots. So like knight g3, e4, knight e4, take, rook f5, and for example, if castling here, then after g4, the pawn on h5 is suddenly weak. There is the threat of gf, followed by knight on e5, and bishop on c6 is now looking pretty damn good on that location, right? So you guys see how that bishop became useful. But that's only because white allows this f5 thing by playing knight f1. He should have played either bishop b5 to neutralize that bishop and neutralize f5, or castle first here. Yes, so he played knight f1, and Zukertort amazingly, because in that time sacrificing the pawns and pieces were considered to be pretty much a norm in order to open the position, get to the pawn and king. So I'm very surprised that f5 was not played, because this is one intuitive pawn sack followed by a3, and very intuitive pawn sack here, right? Because black just opens and clears up the diagonal for his bishop. the very important bishop on g7. And of course, white can try and play bishop e4, but in this position, queen a3 is pretty difficult to find. But it is an important move because it prevents queen b3 check. It also traces the queens, and despite being pawned down, white's structure of these pawns here is not that great because he did not manage to finish his development, and development is huge here. For example, if you take on a3 and rook a8, knight f6, preventing g4, right? And there is a huge threat of rook a2, rook c3. So if king d3, b6, again, black can just play cautiously, and he is better because in the end his pawn structure here is better. So for example, knight here, check, or rook a4 immediately. The threat is rook d8 check, so black plays just bishop f8. He's not rushing, and at some point either pawn on h5 or pawn on a2 will fall, and and black is better. So f5, extremely important resource which Zukertort missed, and this was a second chance that he missed, and he's not going to get the third chance in order to get the advantage. He would miss later inequality, so he played knight c5 and bishop c2, and now you cannot play f5 really because of the check on c4, right? Check on c4 and takes on e5, and black just loses the piece. So that was a huge problem. Instead, he plays rook fd8. I believe that knight e6 is the same thing because rook fd8, knight g3, black will have to... he plays bishop d7, which I don't really like. I like the knight e6 idea. Knight has to go here anyway. It's the best place for the knight in such structure, as the knight can go potentially to the f4 square. He opens the line. And after knight f5, probably queen e8. Probably because... on f6, the queen will not be doing much. Here, the queen is kind of eyeing the pawn on a4, and then black will just play, for example, bishop f8 here, right? This is the standard way of dealing with white knights on f5, because it is only one weak spot in the black position, and one weak spot in the position is not enough to lose the game. And the rest of the black pieces are looking pretty decently, and I don't think that white can claim much of an advantage here. He's certainly better, but this is not enough to win the game. So in the game, what happened is Zukertort plays bishop d7, and Steinitz castles c6. I think is a pretty normal move. I'll play again knight e6 probably first, and same idea with the queen e8 and bishop f8, and if rook g1, for example, then simply f6 followed by bishop b5. And then bishop c6 or bishop a6, because bishop a6 would idea to force white to play b3 to protect the pawn on c4, which will in turn open the a file, while black is pretty much solid on the king side, right? Again, thanks to the pawn formation being already resolved without any breakthroughs except these f4 and f6. So again, this was the normal thing to do. But Zukertort plays c6, and white plays rook d2, which makes sense. Simply he wants to double the rooks on the t-file. Bishop e6, again, great move. Take, and now, again, we are looking at this position where any kid player would automatically play e4 in order to open his bishop, because there is a3 coming, right? a3 coming, and white pawns are on b2, c3 here. You open your bishop, and that's worth a pawn. So guys, remember this trick. I think this is pretty important, so keep this in mind, okay? Because if white just goes something like this, you can take, play a3, and if queen c4, queen c4 is bad because there's check, for example, or knight e5 followed by b5, and black is already almost winning, right? So white has to be careful here. But if he plays something like b4, then black can just take, play knight d7, and with the white king being severely weakened, black bishop on g7 looks like a monster. White pretty much is forced to trade the queens and go on to the endgame here. So bishop knight f6, g4, bishop d1, and then black can play knight d5, again hitting a lot of stuff, and black is doing fine here. He is at least equal, at least. So e4 was the last, not the last chance, but the last idea that Zukertort missed. Instead, he plays very passively. Again, e4, possible, but it's already slightly worse version. He has to find knight e7 here. Again, the idea is after bishop g5, there's queen e3 check, and this endgame should be basically a draw. For example, b5, rook d7, rook f8, rook c7, bishop b4, because of the double nature of white's extra pawn on f5. So this should lead the game to the draw. Okay, so e4 was critical move that would equalize black. Let's see what happened in the game. The game happened knight d7. Black just wants to transfer his knight to f6, which makes sense. Knight f6, bishop e4, and rook d8, which this is strange because this move was considered to be inaccurate by the contemporaries, but it makes perfect sense. Black just puts the rook on the only open file. Knight e5 is correctly criticized because I think that if black just took here and played b5, and he's definitely worse, but this is not enough for white to win the game, right? Because of queen f7, critical move. Queen f7 forcing white to choose what to do with the pawn formation. Queen on 7 also prevents the c4 break by white. And if white tries to activate his king, then black will just go for queen c4, and white king has no way to escape the perpetual, right? So for example, queen f6, queen f1, king c2, queen e2, and there is no way to escape the perpetual. So this is basically a draw, even though that white controls the only open file. But because the queens are on board, this position is probably very draw, even without the queens, as we'll see in the other lines. But with the queens on board, it's even easier to make a draw because, for example, king b1, king g7, white can make no improvement in this position. And black queen on f7 is absolutely key to this position. So because it has access to go and ability to go to the c4 square. All right, so that was the easiest thing for black, again, to sort of make a draw. Instead, black tries to play for more with this move. However, because he is behind in score in the match, so he's trying to complicate the situation. But white's position can only, the only person who can be better in this position is white. Again, thanks to his superior structure, thanks to his pair of bishops, and I think Steinitz was very happy to see black trying to play for a win here. In fact, this is one of the things I was wondering about. It would be very interesting to see the match participants actual during game, to see the demeanor at the chessboard, to see the psychology at work, right? All that non-verbal language, because we can probably guess, I can probably guess that Steinitz was so impressed and happy with his position that his whole demeanor would actually radiate such confidence in his position. And when your opponent is so confident, that surely affects the opponent in a negative sense, right? So b5, normal, a3, I like bishop f8, Zukertort is doing everything correctly, rook d1. And now, again, queen b7 was played, which is probably inaccurate, but it's not a losing move. As the contemporaries mentioned, queen e8 was probably a better suggestion to open the diagonal for the bishop. And after c4, for example, we go to this thematic rook c8 idea followed by knight f6. And again, this position is very close to a draw because it's difficult for white to improve the position without allowing black to play e4. But if he plays bishop e1, for example, then bishop c5. And here we can go even to this game where finally we see the trading happen, right? And bishop endgame. And it seems to be a draw because king f7 is correct. You don't rush with bishop e7. The idea is that white plays king b4, then the black just gives a check, and white is forced to go back or to trade these pawns. And then this is absolute draw because king on f7, black king on f7, he holds everything, the key, squares, and white cannot get to the h6 pawn at all. Cannot make any progress. And if white tries something like bishop c5, then bishop a5 is enough to hold the equality. and because white has no access to the b5 pawn except through the b4 square, and black is simply controlling the square, so this is a draw. And so that was the preferable way for black to play this position. However, he played queen b7, and this pin of bishop on a4 and queen on b7 will prove fatal. But again, thanks to the help from black, right? I mean, these positions are not easy to defend. So Zukertort plays c4, I mean, Steinitz plays c4, and Zukertort misses his chance for the correct defense, which is rook c8. Because in the game he takes on c4, and this position is already much better for white, probably close to winning, because the weaknesses on c6 and a4, together with the strong pair of bishops for white, makes this extremely unpleasant for black. So, as mentioned by contemporaries, even by Steinitz himself, rook c8 was much stronger move, utilizing the fact that there is a pin on the c file, and white cannot really capture the knight on d5, right? And because he loses the queen. So white will be forced to do something else, and one of the computer suggestions is bishop c5, but this is just a total draw, and this is because of the opposite color bishop nature of the game. But if white doesn't do that, he has to do something else, like rook d3, for example, the move suggested by Steinitz, but he completely missed the line with b4. I mean, Steinitz suggests knight f4, but after rook d2, the knight on f4 is completely cut off. He has no squares, and white's bishop on a4 is unopposed. However, black can and he will play b4, and of course the next line is absolutely forced, otherwise white is just worse. So queen a4, bishop a3, and rook b3 seems to be the only move. Otherwise, black will just play rook b8, and white will be under a huge attack. So rook b3, and now the critical move of the game is rook a8, forcing white to go into this endgame. And because of this threat of a2, white has no time for b3, right? So he has to take this pawn, which means that black can just capture this pawn. And if king c2, rook c4, king b3, rook c3 protects the bishop, and rook is protected by the knight, and black is in fact slightly better here. So white should play something like king d1, but after rook c4, it's an extra pawn for black. Again, the knight on t5 holds everything. Black will just give up this knight to equalize the game. So this is equal game, and this is how Zukertort could have equalized and make a draw. Instead, he takes on c4, and after queen c4, this game is practically lost, because again, the weakness on c6 and a4 combined with the pair of bishops strong for white make this game really lost strategically for black. Alright, and now queen c3 was played, attacking the pawn on a5. White demonstrates patience because he knows his structure is better, and he is winning this game. So knight d5, queen c4. Queen c2 could have been played, but it's probably the same thing. And now simple queen d3. Black doesn't have knight d5 anymore. He should probably have tried to play knight d5 just to get rid of his weakness and go for sort of active spielen. Try to create some threats along the c file, or simply activate his pieces, because that will be his last chance. All right, he is much worse, but he is at least having some active counterplay. Instead, he plays passively bishop e7, and after rook c2, white rook arrives to the c file, where the rook is extremely well placed. It protects the king. It helps to attack the pawn on c6, and black, of course, had to play rook c8, but he plays knight d5, which loses immediately. After rook c8, you know, white still has to demonstrate some skill in order to finish this game in his favor. He's clearly better, but he has to prove still more. Right, but after knight d5, queen c4, there is nothing to prove because there is no rook c8 move because of bishop d5, and pin is winning for white. And instead, black goes for this last sacrificial attack. He plays bishop a3, and Steinitz, of course, realizes this is nothing, so he just grabs his bishop and plays bishop d5 and king e3. Very accurate move. And black has only a few more checks left, but they are not very serious, as rook on c2 and bishop on f2. They take away all the key squares around white king. He's Steinitz left with the clear piece up, and in fact, it's now black sovereign, which is under attack. So after king h7, f6, trade, and queen e8, black resigns the game because there is no defense against either queen f7 or queen f8, queen g7. So very interesting game, very modern pawn structure, especially in the beginning. We see this e5, e4 with the white castling to the queen side, and then going for this f5 square with his knight. And it's pity that black did not play knight e6 and try to put the knight on f4 or bring the bishop on f8, which is a modern way of playing this position. And in that case, it would be very interesting to see how Steinitz would do, because the bishop on c2 he is really passive. But black, even despite his solid opening play, then he was stuck in a passive position, and very uncharacteristically, black did not play e4, which is simply amazing to me, because that seems to be just in tune with the chess, romantic chess that was played at the time, and that's by playing passive, black basically made himself ready to lose the game. All right, so that was the game for today, and we'll continue with the later games of the match. There are only 3 or 4 games left in this match, but again, we see that a lot of positions are still very educational to this day. So stay tuned for more, and we'll see you guys soon.